Come on, you can do better than that. Good. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to anticipate the first question, and that is, can I get the slides? And the answer is yes. The slides have already been posted. That's often the first question anybody asks at any presentation. The first observation I typically have about groups like this is it's amazing how faculty are just like their students. They all gravitate to the back of the room. And I notice that many of you have your computers open, so you are doing to me what your students do to you, and I want you to know, at least for my purposes, that's okay. It really is okay. I want to talk this morning about innovation, infrastructure, and digital learning. My friend, colleague, and occasional co-conspirator, Jim Pazinski, was very kind in his opening remarks. Let me just sort of supplement that a little bit in terms of campus computing was launched in 1990 as a way to provide benchmarking data for institutions to see how do we compare to peer institutions on a variety of IT planning and policy issues. This is the ACAO Digital Fellows Project. There are 31 institutions, including UNC General Administration or the System Office and UNC Charlotte, the campuses, the provosts are participating in this initiative. Unlike traditional fellowships, which are about an individual portfolio, this is very much about provosts helping to create a portfolio of resources that work and maybe some stuff that doesn't work, and cautionary statements to other institutions, to their peers, about the role of digital learning in post-secondary institutions. To a Degree is the post-secondary success podcast of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. For this audience in particular, I would call your attention to a program we will post next week, which is about a new report from Arizona State University and the Boston Consulting Group, a fairly large and a very good research project looking at the role of digital learning in terms of promoting access, academic efficacy and outcomes, and also some of the cost issues. That will be up on February 28th. The website is To a Degree. And finally, at the risk of shameless self-promotion, the digital tweed blog at Inside Higher Ed. Now, admittedly, many of you know one another, and I have just parachuted in from a mystical and mysterious place called California, so I don't know much about many of you. My background is polling, is survey research. In a prior life, I used to be the Associate Director and Operating Officer of the UCLA's Higher Ed Research Institute, perhaps best known to many of you for the source of the annual survey of college freshmen each year, several hundred students as a source of data about attitudes and aspirations, both in terms of majors and careers, how students expect their college experiences, demographic and other really useful data that's the foundation for a lot of the research that is now part of the student success initiatives and some of the conversations about big data. So because my background is in survey work, because I don't know you, and I find it always helpful to try to at least know a little bit about the group. How many of you are faculty members? Okay, how many of you work in IT? Broadly defined academic support or other stuff? How many of you have other responsibilities that are more important than the first two groups? Okay, great. And because I kind of scanned the room before the lights blinded me, I saw there were folks who have full heads of hair and others like me with gray or thinning hair. How many of you sent your first email before 1985? Anybody? Let's stand and applaud those folks. It was not easy. How many of you sent your first email between 1996 and 1990? A few more. The third group is the AOL group. You bought AOL starter packs not because you wanted AOL, but because you wanted the free modem. How many of you between 1990 and 1995? And then finally the group after what Tom Friedman in The World is Flat called the internet moment after 1995. And finally, how many of you hate email? What has gone from being cute and convenient now has us all captive, where others are expecting us to respond as soon as the thing hits the screen. Great. So let's move forward. I want to talk about great expectations for information technology to sort of provide a long-term frame for our conversation. Books will be obsolete in public schools. Have you heard this recently? Yeah. Scholars will be instructed through the eye. So I don't have to read the rest of this for you. This is Thomas Edison. And he's talking about what was then called moving motion pictures. And he's talking about motion pictures in July 1913, 15 years before the first talkie, as a role of how technology will transform education. It's kind of a marker in terms of thinking about the role of technology and great aspirations on the part of both people within education, K-12 and higher ed, and outside of education, in terms of the potentially transformative value and the power of various kinds of technologies. Moving into the computer age, the processing and uses of information technology have undergone an unprecedented technological revolution. You've probably heard that one before as well. That could be the framing statement for any of the strategic plans from any of your campuses or the UNC System Office. It's the opening statement of the theme of conferences that are held almost weekly in K-12 and higher ed across the United States and around the world. But if we read on, the language sounds a little odd. Machines are able to deal with many kinds of information at a high speed in large quantities. For those of you who date yourself in terms of the early Saturday Night Live years, this is a little bit like a Conehead skit, massive quantities. We're going to be able to do stuff and manipulate it. Here's the kicker, though. School children will have access to an online tutor, Plato, at their fingertips on the other side of the screen. And this is over 50 years ago. This is Patrick Suppies. Patrick Suppies was a logic professor at Stanford, one of the first people to do computer-aided instruction. He did that on an IBM 1300 series, predating IBM mainframes in the 1960s. There was more memory in the first digital watch that you got in the early 1970s that didn't work than Suppies had access to when he was doing this work. And yet this too stands as a kind of stake in the ground in terms of our aspirations. And finally, sort of moving to the current era, we have some survey data on the part of CIOs and chief academic officers and a little bit with faculty about expectations for digital technology. Digital learning resources provide a richer and more personalized experience. Provosts, CAOs, and CIOs, overwhelmingly yes. Faculty, yeah, not so much. A little bit more skepticism. Curricular resources make learning more efficient and effective. Again, overwhelming support on the part of provosts and CIOs. Faculty, not so much. And then we don't have data for these last two. Faculty here strongly support the use of information technology. We don't have faculty data on that, but again, provosts and CIOs believe that faculty, this is not data unique to North Carolina, it's nationwide data, believe that's the case. And they also believe that senior academic leadership of their institutions, again, this is not about UNC system institutions, this is nationwide, 2- and 4-year public and private colleges, also believe that senior leadership gets it, even as many faculty and others who work in IT may have some reservations about that. So let's ask the question, what is digital learning? Anybody want to venture a definition? Anybody? Nobody? I'm having a hard time seeing through the blinding lights. There is nobody who would like to venture. That's fair. Okay, let me tell you some that I've found. I've scoured the web. To me, the conversation about digital learning almost needs a decoder ring. Many of you remember, if you're my age, you remember those that used to be at the bottom of the cereal box. You how do we decipher what this means into language for civilians? Alternatively, many of you may have the experience common to Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart in his famous quip about pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. There's a great deal of ambiguity about what is digital learning. So let's look at some efforts to try to define it. The first comes from Courseware and Context, from Titan Associates, which has done some work for the Gates Foundation, trying to put an anchor in the ground, put a stake in the ground about what constitutes digital learning. It's a solution with the potential to support student-centered learning at scale in post-secondary education. With due respect to the folks at Titan, that statement needs a decoder ring, doesn't it? In terms of trying to explain what that means. While millions of students use digital courseware today, significant opportunity remains for effective digital courseware. That one's pretty straightforward. We recognize the power and potential of technology, it's ever arriving, and we're beginning to actually see real evidence as opposed to opinion and epiphany that some of this stuff works in a lot of different, in some interesting and important ways. Here's another definition from the Online Learning Consortium. Instructional content that is scoped and sequenced to support the delivery of an entire course through purpose-built software. Please bring forward the decoder ring, once again. I see that, even through the blinding lights, many of you are smiling at that. But the underlying dimension of all these definitions is that it's about student learning. It's not about the technology. We need to stop talking about the technology when we talk about the role of digital pedagogy. The technology, let me put this stake in the ground now as a recurring theme in my presentation this morning. The technology, quite easily, folks, is the easy part. There's a lot of other parts that are a lot more complex. And for those of you who think that a learning management system represents digital technology and digital learning, wrong. It's a platform. It's an application. It's stuff, we pour stuff into it to make materials accessible to our students on screen. They emerged in the late 1990s as a way to help faculty who did not want to learn or weren't interested in learning HTML code in the early days of the internet to load stuff up on the internet. And in many ways, an LMS can be considered, and I've said this on the record, it's a little, in some ways it's kind of like a supermarket scanner. It's an unobtrusive metric to help you understand time on task for students. Now, admittedly, that many are multitasking while they're on the LMS and they're doing other things, but it is a metric in terms of time on task that many institutions are using as part of their big data analytic efforts to understand how students are spending time in different courses, and sometimes sending up a flare and sending an email to students to say, you, Casey, are not spending enough time. Continue this pattern along with other data we have about students like you, and you're going to be going down a dark rabbit hole that you may not be able to crawl out of in your widgets course. Be careful. We want to help you. So insanity prevails in some part of higher education. Many of you may express this privately. I want to talk about where we know it publicly. This, of course, is the definition that we hear over and over again. Doing something over and over again the same way, expecting a different outcome. This is often attributed to Albert Einstein. The Einstein Institute says it's not. But it sounds so much better when it comes from Einstein, doesn't it? Thank you for that. I want to give you another example of insanity, and that's gateway courses. How many of you teach gateway courses? Okay, you can put your hands up. It's okay. You're doing honest work and laudable work. This is John Gardner. Many of you may know John personally or by reputation, or you may have seen him speak. John is, without question, the father, the originator, the source and the force behind the freshman year experience movement that began when he was at the University of South Carolina. At the freshman year experience, at the National Center for the Freshman Year Experience, he has now got the John Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education, and he is committed to helping to redefine gateway courses. It's John's view, and I think it's a fair one, that gateway courses reflect in some ways insanity when we look at the large number of students in key gateway courses who do not succeed, and we send them back to do the same course over and over again without tinkering the course, as opposed to looking at the process and looking at the course. It's a Bermuda Triangle, to use John's word. Students vanish in there. And once they get lost in that Bermuda Triangle, unfortunately, many talented students never emerge, or they never emerge intact in terms of a sense of their self-confidence and their self-esteem and their aspirations for higher education and what happens in terms of their collegiate careers. So technology is a conversation about change, isn't it? And every time we reach for technology, personally and organizationally, it means we're going to change something. And at the risk of imposing a California story on North Carolinians, let's ask the question, how many psychologists in California does it take to change a light bulb? So you have an answer.
One, but the light bulb has got to want to change.
That's almost right. In fact, none. The light bulb has to want to change. Then you can change the light bulb. You have to express a willingness to change, and then somebody can change the light bulb for you. Thank you. You are the first person in 2 years who've done that, both in terms of coming forward and getting the answer right. Thank you. So I am very appreciative. Takes the burden off of me for 5 seconds. But that's a good metaphor for what we have in higher education. We talk about change a lot. We talk about the need for change. Of course, none of you need to change. It's some of your colleagues who are not with us today, right? That's often a laugh line and sometimes even an applause line. You can applaud, or some of you are nodding your heads. But a lot of the conversation about technology is a conversation about risk, and it's a conversation about change. And it's not about the technology in and of itself. It really isn't. So I want to digress a little bit. I want to talk about Dwight Eisenhower, which may seem a really odd topic for a conversation about innovation and infrastructure and digital learning. Most of us know Dwight Eisenhower as the commander of the D-Day forces in 1944, who helped win the Second World War in Europe. We know him as President of the United States from 1953 to 1961. Many of us may not know that for a short period of time between winning the war and winning the presidency, Dwight Eisenhower was the president of Columbia University. Now, Eisenhower grew up in came of age in military organizations. He was a student at West Point. He worked for other generals. These are command and control environments, very different organizationally and culturally than higher education. So it's kind of an interesting twist that Eisenhower would go from a military organization to an academic organization, which I think it's polite to say we are not a command and control culture, are we, for the most part. In fact, we have a lot more autonomy than individual members of military organizations, regardless of rank. And there's a story about Eisenhower shortly after the announced appointment, but before the formal investiture. He's walking across the campus with the provost at Columbia, talking about a number of key institutional policy issues. And there's one issue the provost explains to the general, that in fact there is a big difference of opinion between the faculty and the administration. And Eisenhower, given that he came of age in military command and control cultures, turns to the provost and he says, why doesn't the university simply tell the faculty what to do? To which the provost, without missing a beat, says, General, the faculty are the university. The university are the faculty. And in our conversation about digital pedagogy, it's essential that we remember that fact. That the conversation about going digital is a conversation about faculty and students. It's not a conversation about the technology. The technology is a tool, it's a resource that may or may not work. And I want to be very clear about that. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Often, at least to date, we make a lot of these decisions and investments based on opinion, epiphany, and good intent. We're starting to begin to build a body of evidence about what does and doesn't work. I'll show some examples of that as we go a little bit forward. But this is a really critical issue. This is not a matter of dicta. We are going online. You will put your course online. We are not these kinds of environments. If we're going to succeed in our conversation about digital pedagogy, faculty have to feel it works. Faculty have to know that this stuff makes a difference. Faculty have to feel safe and protected in this process. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go forward. So teaching is a high-touch profession. For those of you who are faculty, I would ask yourself, take a moment, how did you get here? And I don't mean you took an Uber to come to Durham, but I mean in terms of your career choice. Because at least the national data that we know about year in and year out for decades is that college students don't go to college to become college professors. Ours is a recruited career. Somebody touched you. You know, college students, when we look at the national data about college freshmen, they want to study certain majors. They want to study business or accounting. They want to study political science. They want to study biology because they're hidden pre-med majors. They want to study particular subject areas, and they know about careers before they get to college in terms of the public presentation of those careers and their lives, you know, in their neighborhoods. And quite honestly, if you think about the media and the literary presentation of faculty, not so great. You know, we're secondary characters, we're idiosyncratic, we're high-strung. The one time we actually had a television program, thank you, Richard Dreyfuss, we didn't come off so well, and it didn't last past 1 year, I believe. So, you know, we don't learn about what it means to be a faculty member until we get to college, and then we get recruited. We get recruited through the filter of areas of subject area interest in terms of engineering, computer science, the humanities, social science, whatever it might be. Somebody touched you, I'm guessing. And somebody fostered you, and somebody encouraged you, somebody gave you kind words, somebody gave you an opportunity, dragged you into a lab, asked you to do something, made you a TA, asked you to assist, and said, you can do this. And said, you know, there's a tweed jacket at the end of the cycle. Metaphorically. You know. And then you went to graduate school, and the joys of being an assistant professor. Wasn't that fun for those of you who made it through that process? But it's a high-touch experience. And we try to do our best, you know, to touch those students in the sense of try to offer, where appropriate, the same kind of encouragement for students who think, you know, this may be an opportunity for you. Come join us. And learning is a highly personalized experience. And most of us, you know, came of age in a world where higher education was high touch. And yet, you know, we have seen, go back to Al Gore and the internet superhighway in terms of the 2000 conversation, the emergence of the internet, and we've been confronted with this false dichotomy versus high tech versus high touch. And it is a false dichotomy. We are confronted in higher education as elsewhere with the innovator's dilemma. This is actually a joke in the software industry sometimes. The story is that God could create the world in 7 days because there were no legacy systems and no legacy users. And I would ask you to take a quiet moment to reflect about what that means in the world around us in higher education. We have a lot of legacy systems and practices and users, none of you, of course, but perhaps some of your colleagues, in terms of the challenges that confront us when we want to do, with good intent, to make some change, to do some things different. Because technology is a metaphor for change, and it is also a metaphor for risk. If we do something different, there is inherent risk in that process, and we want to minimize that risk. You may think that the first time you got a cell phone, there wasn't much risk in that, but there was. There was risk in terms of how much would it cost when it was 45 cents a minute and $45 a month. How much would you overspend? We all kind of hoarded those minutes carefully. How much risk could there be using an overhead projector unless you fumble with the slides? How much risk could there be using a PowerPoint unless you kind of fumble on the keyboards? I mean, there's lots of different risks that we confront. And in fact, that's what the literature tells us. Technology is a means of uncertainty reduction. We want to make change, but we want to be sure that we can do the change and minimize the potential risk, whether it's a large risk or a small risk. Technological innovation creates a kind of uncertainty. Will this work? I would ask you to think back not that many years, for those of you who remember the days when classrooms were not outfitted with permanent projectors, and we had cows, computers on wheels, crash carts. Wheel it in, you'd lose the first 5-10 minutes trying to be sure if you could connect to the screen. Some of us, not you necessarily, but some of your colleagues would feel awkward, and you'd hear your students snickering in the back of the class about why can't they type, those kinds of things. In terms of, there's a risk in terms of what's the presentation, will the technology work? And the information decision process is essentially motivated to reduce uncertainty. How do we make change and minimize the risk in that process? This is from Ev Rogers. Some of you in the social sciences and other fields may know this work, The Diffusion of Innovation, one of the most widely cited tomes in the social science literature. And it tells us a lot about the experience of risk and change and technology in higher education. Now again, those of you who sat or slept through introductory statistics may recognize this. It's a standard distribution of population. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low, it's spread. What Rogers tells us from his work, and he studied school districts innovation, he studied agricultural innovation with seed corn, the introduction of cell phones, and dozens of other kinds of innovations in organizations and in different cultures and societies, consumer and corporate, is that we have different groups of folks. This is language that has sort of slipped into the common lexicon, many of us without knowing the source. There are innovators, the earliest folks. They are venturesome. They just get it and they do it, and they go forward. There are the early adopters, the second wave. Now, it turns out, when we look at these things, it turns out the innovators are not necessarily the best role models for the rest of us. It's that second wave, because most of us can only deal with about one standard deviation of dissonance. And I'm not like Sue. Sue is an innovator. Sue is my departmental colleague. She gets this stuff. She's adventuresome. She's willing to take risks. I'm not like Sue. But Paul, on the other hand, even though I respect Sue, she's a colleague and much beloved, I'm closer to Paul. And if I can see that Paul can do this stuff, I can begin to visualize that I can do this stuff. And one of the early things that we learned in our efforts with technology, when many campuses gave grants to the innovators, the hope was, we'll go to a number of innovators, we'll give them some seed money for pilot projects, we'll have them come back and report on what I'm going to flippantly call show and tell days. They get 15 minutes. Used to be a Warhol unit, now it's the equivalent of a TED Talk. The language has changed. Tell us what you did and how you do it, how you did it. I can begin to see myself like Paul. I'm not like Sue in that sense. And so I can begin to reach over and visualize myself in that way. But when we made those grants to the innovators, the problem was they didn't infect in a positive way, they intimidated many of us. I'm not like Sue. I can't do what she does. I don't have the patience or I don't have the support. Because often this was presented to us, many of you who remember the early days of microcomputers, user-friendly DOS. You all remember user-friendly DOS? And how unfriendly it was in an absolute sense as opposed to a relative sense. And even insanely great Macs needed user support. And even today, we recognize the need for user support. And we're beginning to really understand the need of user support as part of the essential infrastructure in our conversation about digital pedagogy. that most of us can't do this on our own. We need different resources and support services for ourselves and our students to make this work. So technology is disruptive, right? It creates a little chaos. It's very clear, both individually and organizationally, what happens in that process. There's in terms of organizationally and individually. And for me, in terms of the work that I've done, a lot of this comes down to visualization. Can I see myself doing this? Again, I can't see myself doing what Sue has done. I might be able to see myself doing some of what Paul has done. And the response to disruption is very well documented. We understand what happens, whether it's my personal life because of technology or other things, or also organizationally. Let's talk about organizationally for a moment. So the response is first, you can't quite see, we there? Denial? Yes, denial. So think about what happens in academic organizations. With due respect to those of you who think that Windows NT is a great operating system, it's a little old. Microsoft has called it back. And you've probably been told, end date, no more support. But you kind of like it. You're used to it. You don't want to learn some of the nuances of a new interface, or some of the new stuff with a Mac, or other applications in terms of institutional systems. So when you're told that rollover date is August 15th, the response is no. Or deny, I don't need to do that. You guys go do that. Why are you going to do that? And why are you going to spend that money on that anyhow? Why don't you just give the money to me? I've got a better reason to use it. The next level is anger. Sort of, if you get pushed to shove, our inner 2-year-old comes up, you can't make me do that. I can't be forced to do that. We go to bargaining. Okay, I understand that it's really important that we all use this new widget here at Acme College or Acme University or Acme Community College, and the rollover date is August 15th, but my unit and my department, my group is not ready to do that. We'd like an extension. Can we get an extension? How about October 30th? There's just too much other stuff going on. We need some additional time. What about, we've got this fallow time at the end of the year, after the end of the term. Can we do that? We'll take care of it the last 2 weeks of December. We'll be up by January 10th. But actually now we really need till Valentine's Day, which becomes Arbor Day. And we kind of bargain for this stuff. Then we get depressed because we confront the fact that we actually have no choice. We've got to do it. And there's begrudging acceptance. Does this sound familiar to many of you in terms of Kubler-Ross? Because it's exactly the same process that we experience when these things become mandates and we're told to do it in terms of how we deal with this disruption. There is a Maslow metaphor in all this. Any of you psychologists? Any of you sat or slept through introductory psychology? Again, Maslow is one of the things that has sort of worked into the common lexicon about basic needs versus actualization. The Maslow metaphor for this is the visualization. Can I see myself doing it? It goes through these steps of trust and reliability. Is the infrastructure good? What's the epiphany? Where can I apply it? Where's the evidence that makes it compelling? And finally, how do I do the integration in terms of the way I work? In terms of the steps in that process. Okay. We are skeptical. I showed you some data earlier about how faculty, compared to IT officers and CAOs, view the role of digital pedagogy. Even CAOs and CIOs have some concerns. These are 2 national surveys of CIOs and CAOs I've conducted in the last 2 years. We have asked, on a scale of 1 to 7, how would you rate the effectiveness of your institutional investments over the last several years? And the data you see in the bar charts is the scale of 6 and 7, very effective. On-campus instruction, less than 50% or barely, just a little over a third for CAOs, approaching half for CIOs, less than 50% in other areas. And analytics, which has been the subject of so much conversation. President Spellings, who in her tenure as Secretary of Education made the circuit to a number of ed conferences some years ago, citing the Deming dicta, "In God we trust, all others bring data." Our early forays into analytics are not all that successful as well, even as we talk about the power and potential of big data as assessed by IT officers and chief academic officers. We have to do better. It's sort of like, it's okay, it's not great, we've got some problems. How do we figure this out and get value and have our investments meet our expectations for these things? I said earlier the key campus issues about technology are not about technology, and they are not. Quite honestly, tech is the easy part. Here's the challenges. It's people, planning, programs, of course, none of you. It's priorities, it's egos, it's IT entitlements. You go get that for me. You have to do this for me. And the institutional challenge from the work that I've done for the past 3 decades really, I can't quite see this screen, is, as I said earlier, how do we make digital learning both compelling, that there's evidence that this stuff works, and for faculty to say, why should I change? That it benefits students in terms of efficacy and outcomes, and also safe. So I don't look foolish in front of my students when I use it, and I'm not at risk with my colleagues when I do it if it doesn't work, in terms of review and promotion. And the challenge we confront in this conversation across all institutions is, first we have to document the evidence of impact. And we do a terrible job. We just don't invest in the assessment process when we do these things. Even when we do small pilot projects, it's pretty much the epiphany or the assessment of the individual who's doing it. Did it work? Yeah, it kind of worked. Sort of worked. Well, how do you know? Well, I got some good feedback from it. Well, do you have hard data? No, we didn't have money to do that. We didn't have time to build the formal evaluation mechanism for this, in terms of how we would do it. We need to provide recognition and support for faculty, which I've argued for years is essential. Too often, faculty, and particularly younger faculty who often carry the heavy burden on this in their departments, fall on their digital swords because they're not protected. Because there are 4 reasons this is not recognized as valued. It's not recognized as under an encompassing definition of scholarship. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody who puts a syllabus, pours it into an LMS, gets 3 points in the review and promotion process. But I'm suggesting for those who say curricular innovation in my particular subject area is part of what I view as my scholarship, and makes that investment, ought to be recognized, rewarded, and protected in that process. I'll come back to that in a moment. And we need to do a better job of communication, because we do a terrible job of communicating both among ourselves and off campus. Think about the role of regents of boards of state legislatures. When public institutions in particular go outside and say, we need more money for technology. When cities and states and municipalities need more money for highways, you drive down the highway, you see a big sign that says your tax dollars are at work, and you know the investment of repaving the highway will last for X number of years. You can see the benefit. When we ask for money for technology, the half-life of that investment is 18 months at best. And we do a terrible job of documenting what that does, explaining how that's used. Technology investments are not a capital investment, they're an operating cost because of the short half-life of our software investments and licensing, of our hardware investments for platforms and resources. And we've done a terrible job of discussing that internally and explaining that externally as well. I want to come back to visualization. I said this was very important for individual faculty members. Let me take a few moments to say how important. So we are in the middle of the Olympics. Are any of you watching the Olympics? Great stuff. Go USA. Exciting. Always unpredictable. Historically, part of the programming for the Olympics often has these segues before showing the main competition of the training of the athletes. It's kind of an up-close and personal view of that individual, that person. Get to know the person competing. And we learn about their training, we learn about their families. When we learn about the training, we learn not only about the skill training, but the psychological training. Visualize yourself in the blocks. Visualize yourself at the starting gate. How they go through this process to prepare for this incredibly stress-laden and wonderful competitive opportunity. And yet the reality is all of us engage in visualization, sometimes consciously, sometimes not. I live in Los Angeles. I got on a plane. I came to Durham. I had to visualize some stuff about today. And I've done this all through my career, as many of you have. What messages could I send in terms of visualizing myself as I stood in front of this audience? Now, I've worked in academia for almost 4 decades. And when I first started going to conferences early in my career, I had to think of, really it came down to 2 things: clothing and content. How do I dress? What do I say? And at least early in my career, it was easy because we all, men always all put on the armor in terms of getting dressed. There was a prescribed and in many ways very rigid process in terms of how I would dress. So I took care of clothing, and I was young, uncertain about a lot of stuff, so I had to work on the content part of it. But these things also signal stuff to one another. So if I wanted to be with you here today for this conference, for the Tide Conference, I wanted to signal sort of my academic credentials. I could be here with you in informal academic regalia, tweed jacket, rep stripe tie, khakis. If you turn me around, you might find a chalk stripe where I've leaned against the blackboard. There's a part of my career that Jim Pazisky didn't allude to. I spent almost 2 years as the vice president of anowdead.com. We spent about $180 million of other people's money for an early and unfortunately unsuccessful version of QR codes, scan barcodes, take you to websites. So if I wanted to convey myself as somebody who works in the technology industry, I could be here channeling Steve Jobs in Internet War, And finally, as I thought about my clothing choices before getting on the plane, I could have put on my red dress. And for the record, for nuance, notice, you can't tell from the distance probably, but this or age-appropriate opaque hose and matching red shoes. The men are saying, what's he talking about? And the women are saying, oh, somebody sort of gets it. That's okay. But if I were here in a red dress today, I would feel awkward. I would feel exposed. I would feel stupid in front of you. And I think that that's part of the issue of feeling safe for many faculty in terms of their role with technology. I mean, the reality is that the Oedipal aggression of smartasses like me in a classroom 40 years ago has changed dramatically in terms of making snide and snarky comments in the back of the room to the student today who in the midst of a presentation holds up a tablet or a notebook and says, oh, Dr. Green, Professor Green, yo, prof, that's a really interesting presentation, but your data are 5 years out of date. I'm scanning the website of the source for your graphic and it's just old or it's wrong. Or the student who comes knocking on my door on Tuesday, having in the closing moments heard me say our class last week, read the article by Susan Jones. It's the transitional article for the next part of the course, really important in terms of the literature and the subject area. Comes knocking on my door before class on Tuesday in office hours. You know the old joke about office hours? Office hours protect you from your students. Bounded time. Inappropriate, but it's an old joke told among older academics. And says, Dr. Green, Casey, that article by Susan Jones was really interesting. Wow, that's great. We all like it when students actually read before class. That's a good thing. And I had some questions. No, I'd be happy to talk with you about that. Well, you don't need to. Pardon me? Well, you've kind of indicated you're not all that comfortable with email. You're not always accessible on the weekends. And her email address is at the bottom of the article. So I sent Susan Jones an email. Pardon me? You sent Susan Jones email? Yeah. And she was actually very kind. She responded within about an hour or two. Susan Jones responded to your email? Yeah. She never responds to mine. And so I had some questions, and she was very kindly answered. She said, well, how did you find my article? And I said, it was part of your syllabus. She said, oh, could you send me the syllabus? And the URL for the syllabus. I said, well, but your URL's not on the, your syllabus isn't posted online. So I scanned it and sent it to her. You sent Susan Jones my syllabus? Yeah, and she sent some comments back. I hope this doesn't apply against my grade, but she says it looks like it's out of date. And then she's kind of, do they really let people like you teach here, under those circumstances? The students have access to the same stuff we do. So they go at us no longer for our demeanor, but for the content stuff, which is the heart of what we do. The landscape has changed. It's visualizing ourselves safe and compelling in this environment. And that becomes, can I do this? Can I visualize myself doing this? Why should I do this? What's the evidence of benefit? What have we learned over 4 decades? At the risk of shameless self-promotion, plus ça change. The more things change, the more things stay the same. And this is the cover on the left side of side of the screen is a piece in the EDUCAUSE review that's part of the package that's in the PDF. We have experienced incredible technological change, without question. Many of you are walking around with cell phones and other devices that have incredible amounts of memory, do incredible kinds of things that we couldn't even have envisioned. Some of you who have Apple Watches, you're living the world of Dick Tracy that was thought about 60 years ago in terms of messages and communications on your wristwatch, on your wrist and other kinds of things. And at the same time, if we're honest with ourselves about what goes on in higher education, we have a continuing set of infrastructure issues about managing expectations. What can we really do? Training and user support, which is essential. Instructional integration, how do we make this stuff work appropriately in the right context at the right time as opposed to just it's a hammer we use always? What's the evidence of impact? Is it beyond opinion and epiphany? Do we have real data? Citing President Spellings, who cites W. Edwards Deming, the father of statistical quality control. And the recurring issue of money and budgets, because IT budgets nationwide, particularly in public institutions, have been under severe attack for the last several years in the wake of the budget downturn. Most institutions have not fully recovered, and yet the demand for IT resources and services continues to explode. The conversation about innovation is one that you have to really look at as an ecosystem. At the center of that ecosystem is compelling innovation. What is it that we want to do? And then around it, we've got all this other stuff. There's a back-end infrastructure. There's alliances that we connect to that add value. Are we supplementing and supplanting certain resources? And where's the issue of user support in terms of making this work? It's the innovation in and of itself doesn't work. Again, it's this, how do we minimize the risk and maximize the benefit of what we hope to do? And a really great example of this is when we look at textbooks. How many of you are looking at or involved in something called OER, Open Educational Resources? So there's a lot of buzz about OER. Free textbooks, going to save students a lot of money. Our national surveys of faculty say, yeah, that looks like a good thing, but faculty are really concerned about quality. How do I know about the quality of Casey Green's widget OER textbook compared to the widget textbook I've used for a number of years that comes from Acme College Publishers, where they've got all the editorial support, they do all the vetting, they do all this updates, they provide me with a website and test sets and everything else. Because this is not an apples to apples comparison. Casey's widget OER free or nominally free low-cost textbook against what's available from Acme College Publishers. It's apples to orchard. There's a whole orchard of resources available to faculty members. Many of you use and depend them, and the question becomes, what's the compelling reason to change other than cost? And we also know that, quite honestly, while faculty are very sensitive to the cost issues about textbooks, they are also very concerned about the prerogative of choice for course resources. And in the conversation about cost versus choice, choice wins in most instances, for most institutions. Let's recognize, and I said this earlier, the false choice about high-tech versus high-touch. Some of you may recall, and it's worked its way again into the common lexicon, the conversation about high-tech versus high-touch. They are joined at the hip. This comes from Megatrends in 1982. The more high-tech, the more high-touch. And nowhere do we see this, but have yet to recognize it in many ways in higher ed, the issue of digital pedagogy and online learning. You just don't throw it on the web. You just don't do it with PDFs. Faculty need support, students need support. There's a report that will be out, I believe I mentioned this earlier, from ASU Boston Consulting Group, a really good empirical research study about the efficacy and the cost of digital learning. And there's a very clear message there about support. ASU has 200 plus people doing instructional support and development for their online programs. University of Central Florida, another institution with a reputation in this area, has over 90. That's not what most institutions can do and can afford. But it speaks to the issue about the essence and the essential nature of support if we're going to do it. And if we're going to do this, we need to recognize the elements of a campus plan in terms of realistic definitions and expectations, in terms of faculty recognition and reward, in terms of a broad definition of scholarship, training and user support, evidence of impact, and sustained support. It's not a one-off, it's a continuing process. The conversation about digital pedagogy in conventional classrooms, in hybrid environments, in online courses is tech-enabled high touch. Let me cite 3 examples. Some of you have heard about the ASU Baccalaureate for Baristas initiative with Starbucks. Initially, they cherry-picked a little bit in terms of eligibility. Students who had 2 years of college could enroll in ASU online. Now they've opened it up. The magic there is not that ASU has good, high-quality online courses. The magic there is that ASU has good, high-quality courses and great support for the faculty who develop those courses and for the students who take them. It's a gestalt. It's tech-enabled high-touch. The sum is more than the parts. It's not just what's on screen. It's what's behind the screen to support students. Many of you have heard about Georgia State University, where in academic light year speed, they have eliminated the historical gaps between different student populations, particularly first-gen and students of color. 5 years. The public statement about that is it was done with analytics. Gee, we threw everything into a big data gumbo pot, we found what the magic variables were, and we pulled the levers. What's less discussed, but equally essential, but critical to that process, is they hired a lot of folks to do academic support services for students. So when they send out the email, and they're very careful to be sure that the student who gets the warning email is not stigmatized by that process, there's also some 3,000 hours of counseling and support services that follow it up for those students. There is an infrastructure there, as opposed to just a stigmatizing email that says you're in trouble. And there's the Math Accelerator at Austin Community College, where they took over a dead mall, one that was at one time the leading mall in Austin, Texas. And they've converted that space as an instructional center. Austin Community College has an instructional mission. The geography of the community college's mission is equivalent to the state of Connecticut, I believe, when I've talked with folks there. And the Math Accelerator has 600 computers in clusters. They're using ALEX, adaptive learning software from McGraw-Hill, to do developmental and to take students up to college level math. They have not replaced the faculty. They have provided a technological supplement so faculty can work more directly with students, and the software does some of the heavy lifting and initial interaction with students, and it's working. And it's not just opinion and epiphany, but it's evidence to tell us that it's working. We need to change the data culture in higher education. Again, President Spellings, during her tenure as Secretary of Education, and more recently as President of the UNC system, bring data. In God we trust, all others bring data. We need to change the data culture in higher education, because for too often, internally and externally, data has been used as a weapon. The old model is, what did you do wrong? And the new model in data culture should be, what can we do better? How do we use data as a resource, not as a weapon? How does it give us the path out of the rabbit hole to do better, as opposed to pointing fingers and pointing blame? The goal is to do better. How will data help us understand and do better? Changing that data culture. And we need to stop being afraid of innovation, because I believe that there is a fear of trying on the part of many faculty members who would like to innovate but recognize there's no recognition and reward. At the risk of shameless self-promotion, this is from my digital tweet blog last summer. There was an article at Inside Higher Ed on a research report that said faculty are afraid of trying. Well, there is an innovation in the fear of trying, because there is not enough recognition and reward. We have not expanded the algorithm for review and promotion to use an expansive version of the concept of scholarship as proposed by Ernie Boyer, chairman of the Carnegie Commission on Higher Education some decades ago. This is not for everybody, but for our colleagues and for many of you who say, this is part of my scholarship, you should be able to go forward. It should be an option and an opportunity as opposed to a mandate. Many will not take it, but for those who it is, and particularly younger faculty who are often asked to take on a disproportionate burden, it should be an option, and it should be an expansive version. The reprint's in the packet. So I want to close. I want to talk about Machiavelli. Any of you teach political science? Any of you fall asleep during introductory political science as a college freshman? There's a lot that many of us in higher, we talk about how cutthroat higher ed could be. There's a famous Henry Kissinger quote, the reason the faculty meetings at Harvard were so vicious is because the stakes were so small. Take a moment. That's usually a laugh line. Maybe it's too early in the morning. I want to talk about Machiavelli. Machiavelli lived in treacherous times. At one point he was the consigliere to the prince, and the other times he was spending time in prison because the prince was angry. But the prince is often viewed as being a mercenary document in terms of how do you survive in difficult times. But from an organizational side, there's some wisdom in Machiavelli for those of us who are involved in the conversation about change, broadly defined, not just about digital pedagogy, that may be useful. So I want to talk about these guidelines. So the first is concentrate your efforts. You can't do everything. There's so much opportunity to do stuff here at Acme College with all these things. You can't do it all. Many of us have sat through those campus exercises and planning exercises where you fill a wall with Post-it notes of all the things you'd like to do. You got to pick three. And you got to pick three. Which are the highest priority? Which are the ones that you can actually do? And you have to pick your issues carefully in that process. And you have to know when to fight. Sometimes it's worth the fight, sometimes it's not. Any of you ever an adolescent? Were any of you teenagers at one point? Or any of you have teenagers in your household? Let me get very personal about this. So when my son, who is now 35, was 13, he wanted green hair. Is that a fighting issue? Is that not a fighting issue? I decided not to fight. I stood in the shower next to him and poured the dye in twice to help his green hair moment. And fortunately, the dye didn't take. So two things happened. One, I got points. Not that they carried me much, very long. And two, the issue immediately diffused itself. But there are issues where we did fight. You need to pick the issues that are important to understand that. You need to know the history. Too often in the conversation about change, we could do this, without knowing, in fact, it's been done. We talk about hitting the ground running. No, you need to hit the ground and do a very fast walking tour. Survey the landscape. Understand the context. Because context is everything in these conversations about change. Broadly defined, not just digital pedagogy. You need to make friends. This is the point where the Bette Midler music comes up. Go have lunch. Go have coffee. Meet for breakfast. Find some point of commonality, of shared values and shared concerns with folks who may be a little different. That would be a great lesson for folks in Congress, by the way. But you need to build coalitions if you're going to do this. Folks who will stand up and stand with you. Because if you're on your own or you're just a small group without coalitions, you have less voice and less impact in this process. As you advocate. You want to set modest and realistic goals. If you say you're going to have a 35% gain, and after the period of time you only hit 33%, have you failed? Now, I'm not suggesting cook the data. I want to be very clear about that. But let me give you a classic example of setting expectations. I live in Los Angeles. When I first moved there 4 decades ago, flight time gate to gate from Los Angeles to San Francisco on the commuter airlines was 59 minutes. Today it's 1 hour and 45 minutes. And it's not because there's been continental drift between the two cities. It's because air traffic and other things means it's just getting harder and harder. So the airlines are now telling us, rather than having us all angry that we're 35 minutes late, this is what it's going to take, 1 hour and 45 minutes. Set realistic expectations. Set pragmatic expectations, but set expectations that will also show change and gain. Leverage the value of data. Talk to that a little bit in terms of agree with the appropriate data you need to collect or aggregate going in, how you will use it going out, so people don't do their own personalized analysis and say, well, my data compete with your data. My analysis is different. Have some consensus in that as you go forward. Anticipate turnover, because I don't know of a single project that goes over a year or two where somebody doesn't leave. Jim Pazinski mentioned the Digital Fellows Project. Fellows were selected in June 2017. We've had 4 turnovers or changes among provost positions at 4 of the 31 campuses. Stuff happens. You can't control it. There are people who are key to your projects. You need to anticipate there might be some change. Deadlines help focus what we do. We know that in academia. We know that with our students as we look at the submission of papers and projects, at 5 minutes before the midnight hour because of email. They're no longer slipped under the door. They're kind of sent by email. But deadlines help focus. But constantly remind people of deadlines so they're actually working towards them as opposed to making that mad rush. And finally, recognize nothing is static. And the conversation about change in and beyond technology, this is dynamic. You have to anticipate change. You can be halfway through a project and you get data saying it's not working. Well, why continue? Or the application changes and you have to go back. Nothing is static in this conversation, whether it's technology or other stuff. Thank you very much for your time. You've been a very generous audience.